I told you last week that we were going to begin a series that is, I've looked, and almost 7 years old. I've never taught twice any lesson as an adult pastor. I got to admit, as an evangelist, I preach the same sermon a lot, but it was always the gospel message, and as an evangelist, it just seemed to fit. But as a pastor, I've never really taught twice. With this one, we've had a lot of requests for video, so I hope that you'll be blessed by it, and we will go through a few weeks of what I call the Gospel of Gethsemane. We know that the Lord had quite a transaction the night of his crucifixion in the Garden of Gethsemane. But there are so many messages in this moment. And this is just one of many messages. This is not the message of Gethsemane. It's one of many messages. Today, I'd like to just introduce you to Gethsemane. It is primarily just introductory material. First of all, when you look at the city of Jerusalem, we are looking from the south to the north, and we see the golden dome of the rock. To the right is a deep, deep ravine and valley called the Kidron Valley, which is very biblical and talked about a lot in the New Testament. And the yellow circle is the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, the garden in those days was not like a botanical garden. A garden in their day was an orchard. It was a place for trees and things like that, and they called them gardens, or at least the Latins did. But it was primarily a place for olive trees. And olive trees, as you drive along the countryside in Israel, just about every flat splotch of ground's got about 20 olive trees on it. 20 to 100 olive trees. They just use every flat spot they can because olives are life. They are a part of the life system of the Middle East. And so this was just one of those orchards of olives that went down the hillside, down to the bottom of the Kidron Valley. At the time of Jesus, there were two bridges that crossed this ravine. We have never found any remnants of those bridges archaeologically. I believe that we will, in the coming days, find them. But we know from about 5 different historical sources that there were bridges that crossed the ravine. So you didn't have to go all the way down to the bottom of the valley and all the way back up. The Hebrews did that, but the Romans weren't about to do that. They weren't going to go through that mess. And so they built bridges across. This is how one of those bridges would have looked at the time of Jesus, okay? This is a bridge that would have taken you across the Kidron from the garden to the temple. You could have crossed this and been in the temple area. If you've been at this church long, and we're not going to go into this deep, but we know that every so often the Jews had to take the ashes of a red heifer. They would take a perfect red heifer and they would burn it on the Mount of Olives in a particular spot where they had to be able to look into the doors of the temple. The doors of the temple would be open. The priest would take the heifer up there, build an altar in that one spot, and the ashes would be burned, and then they would be burned again and until they became a fine, fine powder. The bones were ground and broken up if necessary, and burned again and burned again. Once that fine powder of the ashes of the red heifer was made, then a cup of the ashes would be taken and put into huge containers of water. All right? This is called the water of purification. Anytime something was used in the temple, if something was used in the temple and got blood on it, which is what the temple was all about, it had to be purified because now there's sin on it. Blood representing the sin of the people or the sin of the nation. And so the shovels and the axes and the knives and the scrapers and all the different things that were used in the animal sacrifices had to constantly be purified. And so the ashes of the red heifer, they would be washed in running water, and then the ashes of the red heifer, the water of purification, would be sprinkled on it, and God says, okay, you've obeyed me, and now it's clean again. All right? So the water of purification is necessary for the third temple to be built. If the Jews were tomorrow to build the new temple, and start World War III, which it will, according to the Bible. But when they build the new temple, everything in the temple has to be purified. If they go out in the desert and God shows them where the Ark of the Covenant is and says it's in that cave right over there, and they go, oh, there it is, and they find the Ark of the Covenant, it cannot be put in the temple until the ashes of the red heifer have purified it. It is polluted. It is corrupt. And so right now there are 5 heifers being raised in Israel that are absolutely uncorrupt. There's not a white spot on them. There's not a white hair on them. They are pure in every specific way. By the way, they're all from Texas. And so a Texas billionaire found 5 perfect heifers and in his own plane took them to Israel, and they're being raised just in case the temple needs to be built. The heifers are ready to be burned for the sacrifice. All right? So, this is the ashes of the red heifer were burned here. You would come down the hill, cross the river, cross the bridge into the gates of the temple. The dark area behind it is the Garden of Gethsemane. If we stand at the double gate, at the golden gate of Israel, Jerusalem, and look across the Kidron, we see a huge church, which is called the Church of All Nations. The Church of All Nations is over the rock that is in the Garden of Gethsemane. There is only one rock that sticks above the ground surface. The rest of it is dirt with trees growing on it. But there's a rock that's about, not quite the size of this stage. I've got a picture of it later, but it's a huge flat rock. And so when it says Jesus knelt on the rock and prayed, it's the only rock there is. So we believe this to be the rock of Christ, okay, in the Garden of Gethsemane, and they built a church over the top of it. This is the remaining part of the garden right here. Used to spread clear over to here, and used to spread clear over to here, but all that's been cleared through the centuries of time. But those trees still stand from the Garden of Gethsemane. In 1885, it looked a little bit like this. It was not quite as populated, as you can tell. Here we got churches going all the way up in the top of the Mount of Olives, and on the other side is the city of Bethany. And so in 1885, the garden was here, had a little tiny wall around it, and there was a little tiny monastery right in the corner there, a little square building where they lived. Let me zoom in a little bit. Let's see it there. The monastery in the corner. That monastery is still there, but now it's a 2-story building. They built on top of it. The church now is built in this sector here. This piece of ground right here that is square is a part of the Church of the Crusaders that was built in the Garden of Gethsemane. Okay? It's no longer there. The Muslims knocked it all down during the Crusader Wars, but it's still the foundation of that particular place. In 1940, the Church of All Nations had been built and was a part of the landscape now, but the rest of the hill is still pretty barren. This is what it looks like today. The bubbles on top are the Church of Gethsemane. This is the Church of the Garden, and here's that little building that used to stand, but now is long and tall and is a part of it. And this is the garden that as a tourist, you will be a tourist, and you will enter this gate, and you can walk all the way around the garden. You walk all the way. You can't get into the garden because people were taking chunks of trees and stuff like that. Tourists were, saying John loves Bill and stuff like that in the trunks. So they're not letting people into it, of course. Buses can park all the way up and down. Most people start at the top when we walk down the Hosanna Trail, which memorializes the time of Christ coming into the city and ending up in the garden and crossing over to Jerusalem. On the front of the Church of All Nations are the apostles, painted and sculpted. And inside, it's made to look like the nighttime sky when Jesus would have been praying. Golden stars and a lapis ceiling. This is the rock. It is the only bedrock that sticks up out of the ground. So it's pretty legitimate. Around it are crowns of thorns. And give you a scale there with a priest coming out. He was going to hold Mass there. So again, looking across, this is what we see as the Garden of Gethsemane. The garden, as I showed you with the buildings behind it, the black building, the black outline is today's church. The red outline is the Crusader church. The yellow is the 3rd century church. We have now found the entire foundation of 360 AD of the church built in the Garden of Gethsemane. The Israelis and the Catholics have gotten together and agreed on something, and right now this looks totally different because a tunnel is now being built that will take you under the road and up into the Garden of Gethsemane, and this will be a tourist visitors center. And while they were digging that hole, they were shocked because they found a Jewish mikvah, or baptism, which means this had to have been a Jewish garden. They would have to cleanse themselves before and after work. And so there is a mikvah right underneath the road here where this garden would have spilled down the hillside. This is one of the oldest trees. Now, there is no tree living right now that was alive when Jesus was alive. They were all chopped down. Israel used to be almost forested in many places. There were huge forests all over, but two different things took down the trees. One of them was when the Romans came, they chopped down the trees to use for weaponry. They built their trebuchets and things like that with the wood of Israel, short, stocky wood. But when the Muslims came through, they built a railroad and they chopped down all the trees for the ties for the railroad and literally deforested Israel. The forest started to grow back and grow back and grow back, and then the Ottoman Empire, which again was Muslim, came along. And because they did not want people living in this Palestine land, they didn't want to mess with it, they tried to keep it as desolate and dark and dank as they possibly could. They charged a tax on every tree that you had in your yard or on your property. How's that for mean? Because if you were trying to grow his fruit or olives or shade for your animals, you were taxed. And it was a heavy tax. And so most of the people chopped down the trees on their own land to save money during the Ottoman Empire. This is why Israel has all of these plant a tree funds. Every time, if you look in Israel websites and stuff like that, they're for $10 you can plant a tree. Now there are rolling forests and hills covered with trees all over Israel, and they are native trees. They're replacing the native trees in all of those areas. And the place where we do baptisms on the Jordan River is a place that you can plant a tree. If you're baptized there, you can spend $10 and have a tree planted in your name around that area because it was part of the area that was deforested. But this particular one that you're looking at is, now it's not the time of Christ, sorry, but it is 1,100 years old. The stump is 1,100 years old. And the Bible tells us that out of the base, out of the root of Jesse, a tree will form. And we are called the saplings and the grafted in pieces. When you cut down a tree, an olive tree, sprouts come up and new trees are formed. We have a tree like that around here called a honey locust. Anybody got any honey locusts around your yard? They smell gorgeous in the spring. They have a honey sweet flower that comes up. But I promise you, if you go out there when they're thin and you take your little clippers, you go clip, you go back in a couple weeks, there's 2 of them. And you clip those, you got 6 of them. Every time you clip it, makes it mad and it grows again. Well, olive tree is kind of like that. Olive tree will come right up out of the root system. So this root system is 1,100 years old. See, there's a dead root. That's a dead root. I mean, you look at it, you go, that's a dead root, and there's a tree growing right out of the top of it. This is how olive trees propagate. They are considered tough, hardy, just like the Jews, just like the Israelis. Look at Matthew 26 with me. Matthew 26, starting in 36. Matthew 26, 36. Then Jesus came with them to a place called, say it, and said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And he took with him Peter and 2 sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." He came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, "So you men could not keep watch with me for one stinking little teeny measly hour?" It's not really in there, but I think it was inferred, okay? Keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. I mean, how many times do you hear that said, in your lifetime? And here's where it comes from. He went away again a second time and prayed, saying, "My Father, if this thing cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done." Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them again and went away and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand." And then he's arrested, betrayed, and arrested. Look at Mark 14:32. This is Mark's version, John Mark. Mark 14:32 reads, "They came to a place named Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here until I've prayed.' And he took with him Peter and James and John." Remember it said Peter and the sons of Zebedee, "and began to be very distressed and troubled. He said to them, 'My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch.' He went a little beyond them and fell on the ground and began to pray that if it were possible, the hour might pass him by. And he was saying, 'Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will.' And he came and found them sleeping and said to Peter, 'Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you may not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.' Again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy. They did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, 'Are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand.'" Look at Luke 22, verse 39. "And he came out and proceeded, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples also followed him. When he arrived at the place, he said to them, 'Pray that you may not enter into temptation.' And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and began to pray, saying, 'Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done.' Now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. And being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down on the ground. When he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow. And he said to them, 'Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not enter into temptation.'" Look at Luke 22, 39. "And he came out and proceeded as," what's it say? "As was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him." What do we mean by that, as his custom? It means he knew the Garden of Gethsemane, didn't he? He knew this place. It was a key place for him to pray. Look at Mark 1:35. Jesus lived a life of prayer. Mark 1:35 says, "In the early morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up." Now see, that's just not right. You don't get up before God does. It ain't safe, right? Those of us that get up around 10 or 11 o'clock, we're godly people. We wait for God to get up. Jesus got up before the sun was up, while it was still dark, and he left the house and went away to a secluded place and was praying there. Jesus prayed in the morning. Look at Luke 5:16. But Jesus himself would often slip away to the wilderness and pray. Prayed in the wilderness. Luke 6:12, just go over chapter. It was at this time that he went off to the mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. He prayed at night, not just in the morning. If you're a night person, pray at night. If you're a morning person, pray in the morning. If you're in the wilderness, pray all the time. Amen. Pray till you're out of it. Jesus did. He sets the example. Look at Luke 3. Go back a few. Luke 3:21. Now when all the people were baptized, Jesus was also baptized, and while he was praying, heaven was opened. How many of you know that the baptism of Jesus was a joyous event? So when you're not in the wilderness, pray. As baptism he prayed. Matthew 4:1 and 2. Matthew 4:1 and 2 says, Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit. By the who? Spirit. By the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he then became hungry. How many of you think that he prayed during those 40 days? Amen. You see, the Spirit led him into the wilderness. So whether the devil's led you into the wilderness, whether or not God's led you into the wilderness, you ought to be praying. Jesus set the example for prayer. And I think one of the most important things about the Gethsemane story, it says, and as was his custom. Amen? As was his custom. So we pray during temptation, joy, night, wilderness, morning. We ought to pray. Look at Luke 9:28 and 29. He has gone all the way to the top of Israel, as far north as you can get, to Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon, there's a Roman city called Caesarea Philippi. The Bible says that he went into the district of Caesarea Philippi. And at Caesarea Philippi were the temples to the pagan gods that the Romans had built that went back clear to the Old Testament. The gods had been worshipped at Caesarea Philippi in the mountain there, and there is a huge cave where the water springs out that actually is the headwater for the Jordan River. It's called the River Dan. It's in the city of Dan. And it pours out and mixes up with 4 or 5 other rivers and becomes the Jordan River. People would take their sacrifices and throw them into the water, and if the blood ran one way, then God heard them. If blood ran the other way, God didn't hear them. Jesus was standing there because the place, that cave, was called the gates of hell. And at this moment he said, Who do men say that I am? They said, well, some say you're Elijah, some say you're a prophet, some people say you're something else. He said, who do you say I am? You're the Son of God. And so at this moment, when his disciples said, You are it, you're the one, he says, the gates of hell shall not prevail against you. Do you understand? He was standing in front of what the pagans called the gates of hell. He was standing right there and said, this is going to happen. Now they've left that place. It says, some 8 days after these sayings, he took along Peter, John, and James and went up on the mountain to pray. Who did he take with him? Who did he take into the Garden of Gethsemane with him? Peter, James, and John, yeah. And while he was praying, goes up on a mountain and prays, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah. We have the transfiguration of Christ on Mount Hermon. Tourists are told that it's Mount Tabor. Probably not. It's probably Mount Hermon, because it's right where they were at. And it does say that they went to a high mountain. Tabor is not high by any means. It's a hill that you can climb. But Mount Hermon, you can't. It's pretty tough to get up there. But anyway, while he was there and while he was praying, and so even at the transfiguration, at the revelation of Christ, he was praying. Prayer was a part of his breathing in and breathing out. And it's supposed to be ours too. Now, if we stand again in the city of Jerusalem and look across, the Garden of Gethsemane is down to our left, just outside the picture. There's some key places here on the Mount of Olives that are very important. One of them is the Church of the Ascension. This is the highest spot on Mount of Olives, and it's just traditionally said he probably went to the highest spot to be ascended up. The Bible doesn't say that, but it's a memorial place, okay? Nobody claims that this is the spot, but it memorializes the spot of the ascension. There is a church that is called Dominus Flevit, which is where they memorialize the fact that Jesus wept over the city. And the chapel is built like a teardrop. It's built like a teardrop to memorialize Christ weeping over the city of Jerusalem. And it's about halfway down the hill on the Hosanna Trail. And then over here is where we believe that probably the ashes of the red heifer were sacrificed. There are remains there of altars and that go back to the Israelite period. Can't guarantee it, but it's the best vote in town right now for where we are. If we look down on the city, I want to just take you again. This is introductory. I want to walk you through the last night of Christ's life. Okay, it's one thing to read it. It's another thing to picture it. Because the cool thing about visiting someplace is when we talk about it, you visualize it. When I say, well, you know, if you go to Quail Springs Mall, and people have been to Quail Springs Mall, and I say, you know, you'd park over by Penny's, and everybody pictures Penny's on the one side, on the west side of Quail Springs Mall. Why? Because you've been there. And we communicate and think in pictures, right? This is how we communicate, it's in pictures. If I say red apple, you don't see letters, you see a picture. If I say jumbo jet, you see pictures. So one of the beautiful things about visiting the Holy Land is when you read the Bible, you see the pictures. Not everybody can. So I like to show pictures so that you got an idea of what we're talking about. Is that okay? So that's what we're doing. So if we're looking down, here is the Golden Dome at the bottom of the picture. Here is the Kidron Valley, and here is the Garden of Gethsemane. All right, so we're looking down on the city. If we look down at the city, the purple is the walls at the time of Jesus. Now the walls now go clear up on the right corner up here and close this all in. But at one time it cut in like that. And I can take you and stand you on the rocks that are about this much rock in a road, and I can have you stand on it, and when you're standing on that rock, you are standing on the wall. You're standing on the top of the wall. Remember, the time of Jesus is always 30 feet below you in Jerusalem. There's 30 feet of buildup and buildings being knocked down and built upon and armies knocking it down and building upon it. You have to go down 30 feet to hit the streets of Jesus. So you're literally standing on the top of the wall when you stand on that rock. And it's right in the road. People are walking over it all the time. Guides don't point it out and say this is the wall that Jesus would have walked through to be crucified. This gold X, do you see the X up in the left-hand corner? Is just outside the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, where Jesus was tried and where Peter denied him 3 times. This is on the the Mount Zion, and it's easy to get to. It's a beautiful spot. There's actually a dungeon in the basement where prisoners would have been kept. Yes, Jesus was literally kept in that dungeon. This is the house of Caiaphas. There's no doubt about it. This is the high priest's house, and it's right there. But when you go outside the house, you see this stairs. Those stairs are of the time of Christ. You can see the Golden Dome here. The Kidron Valley is here. Jesus would have been brought over that second bridge and brought up these steps to be tried by Caiaphas. It's one of the few places that I can take people today as a guide and say, stand on these steps. Yeah, you are literally standing on steps that Jesus walked on. We can guarantee that. Because it's from the garden up to the house of Caiaphas. All right? That's the house of Caiaphas up above. Now, some important parts have been marked in yellow there, and we'll talk about those. But let's get started. The green line through the middle is called the Cardo. Every Roman city had a north and south street that was the heart of the city. Therefore, it's called the Cardo, meaning cardiac, the heart. And it's the main thoroughfare where all business and all politics was done. So it went from the left over to the right, from the south to the north in the Cardo. Today you can still see it. We know that the first thing that happened in the crucifixion story, in this Gethsemane and crucifixion story, is that Jesus was in Bethany, which was on the backside of the Mount of Olives, and they went to the Last Supper. So, he went across the lower bridge, went up through the gate, and went up to the place of the Last Supper on the Mount of Olives. I believe it to be true. I believe the archaeology is true. I've made personal friends with one of the archaeologists, David Clausen, who is digging in the basement there and has gotten the permission to do the archaeological work there. And he has convinced me that it is it. I mean, I didn't doubt it, but I wanted confirmation. Then from the Last Supper, they left and went to the garden, right? They sang a song and they went out to the garden to pray. So we have to backtrack now. We have to go back. And we go to the garden. Bethany is on the other side. So they come to the garden, and this is what we just read about. Then he's arrested in the garden. Boom, okay? Well, what do they do when they arrest him? They take him to Caiaphas, to the high priest's house, up those steps to Caiaphas's home. So, he's tried there, and then the Sanhedrin is brought in, and to the house of Caiaphas, and he's tried at this particular spot. Now, Jesus has already walked about 3 miles up to the Last Supper, had the Last Supper, walked about 3 miles back to the garden to pray, and now he's been walked a couple of miles back up the hill to be tried. Then Caiaphas sends him to Pilate. Well, Pilate was living in the palace of Herod the Great, which is still there, and they're excavating now and finding the places of the palace. That follows the road that is ancient that you still walk today. If I take you along this route, which we do, you will have walked the same path that Jesus did. We're 30 feet above it, but we're walking on the same street. Then Pilate says, well, I don't want to deal with him, take him to Herod. Well, Herod the Great was dead, and his sons were ruling, and when Pilate took over the palace for the holidays, Herod had to live somewhere else, so he had a second palace. He had a mansion there in town, and so he was taken down to Herod's home. Herod says, I don't want to deal with him, send him back to Pilate. So he goes back to Pilate. And then Pilate says, crucify him. Now, we all know that there are 2 possible places where Jesus was crucified. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which I believe to be the correct one. It's not pretty, it's gaudy, it's the different faiths have built churches all over it and they've made it ugly. It's not very meditative, it's loud, it's noisy. But archaeologically, it's probably the spot, okay? So, he went from that huge palace then back down and around and outside the city gate to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is right there. But if he was crucified in the garden tomb, which is the pretty one that people get their pictures taken and stuff, I believe it to be a representation of what a garden tomb would have looked like, but I don't really think it's where he was crucified. Could be wrong, but archaeologically I don't think so. Okay? And there are reasons for that, but that'll be another teaching. So, if we go from Pilate to the second cross, then we would go outside the Damascus gate to the garden tomb. So, not only has Jesus been beaten, not only has he been belittled, remember the scourging that he received was so vicious that the bones of his ribs were sticking out. They could see his bones and rib cage. They could see organs on the inside from the outside. Because the scourge of 9 tails that he was whipped with has pieces of metal and bone and glass woven into it. And so when you hit the skin, you ripped out chunks of flesh. And you hit the skin. And pieces of leather this long would strap around you, and you would rip the skin out in huge chunks. And so by the time you receive 39 lashes, he is dehydrated beyond belief. His bones, his inner organs are exposed to the air, and then he has to carry his cross. Not a good night. But at least you see kind of where everything was in the time of Christ and what he went through. If we look at these particular passages, we're not going to because the same ones we looked at a minute ago, but Matthew does not say that Jesus was familiar with the garden at all. It says they just went to the garden and went to Gethsemane. Mark does not mention that he was familiar with this. John says they met there often. And Luke says, as was his custom, to go there and pray. So two of them say that he was familiar with the garden. Two of them don't say that he was familiar with the garden. They just mention it. What was the name of the garden that he went to? Matthew says Gethsemane. Mark says Gethsemane. John says the garden over the Kidron Ravine. Well, we kind of see that's the Gethsemane, but it's not mentioned. And Luke says he went to the place. So we think we nailed where it's at. We think we know what it is and where it's at. Now again, this drawing of the garden and of the basilicas, what you don't see is that here's where you enter. I showed you the tourists entering in. Could go in a circle and then go in the front of the church and worship there. But over across the street is a deep, deep cave that is 40 feet underground. This cave is where they say that Mary perished. Now again, Catholics believe something different than evangelicals. Not putting them down, just giving you information, okay? But they believe that Mary did not actually die. That she was so perfect as Christ, that she was as holy as Jesus was in the flesh. Otherwise, he would have been corrupt had she not been holy, coming out of a corrupt vessel. How could he possibly be perfect? So she had to be perfect. Now, the problem with that is, well, what about her mama? Because how could she come out perfect? But they say, well, when Gabriel came, he made her perfect. So, okay, all right, but they say she didn't actually die. But this is where she went to be assumed into heaven. This is her resurrection place. It's a beautiful cave. It's a beautiful, you've got to walk down 40 feet of steps to get there. But they're wide enough, get this, for 12 people at a time to walk down. It is one honking stairway, okay? And they made it so that the apostles could walk down and venerate Mary, although they were all dead by that time. But anyway, you go down and enter into a chapel that is the place of Mary. But what tourists never, ever get shown is this cave, which is literally walled off. There's a wall and another wall, and you have to slide through this little entry, and then suddenly there's a cave down there. It looks like this when you walk down the little alleyway to get there. There's no signs, there's no marks, there's nothing that shows this cave. It's one of my favorite places in Jerusalem. I must go to this place and spend time with the Lord. Because in this cave, they found a 1st century olive press. Now that means it was a working place, and when it rained in the garden, where do you think the boys went? They probably stepped into this little cave, okay? Inside, they've turned it into a pretty little chapel. But around this rock, if you walk around this rock and go down this little hallway, there's another little cave. Now, it's doored off. I made friends with the priest, who is the priest of the chapel, of the cave, and he wouldn't let me look. Just open it a little bit, just peek in. But it's where they found the olive press. Now, the olive press was destroyed somewhere around the First World War. It disappeared. But we have drawings, we have pictures of the 1st century press that was in there. So I believe that the disciples spent a lot of time in this cave because it was the commercial cave and would have been open all the time, especially to Jews. And so I just love it in there. I just feel the presence of the Lord in there. I really do. So who went with him? Well, Matthew says Peter and 2 sons of Zebedee. Mark says Peter, James, and John, who were the sons of Zebedee. John said, and with his disciples. And Luke says the disciples followed him. So we don't have any type of discretion here or any kind of problems with what's being said. It's just different people's interpretation of what they want to write down. People look at these things and say, see, the Bible's not true. The Bible's not true. One of them said this, one of them said that. Oh, give me a break. Wouldn't you feel it was a little fishier if they all said exactly the same thing? Like they all got together and concocted a story and said, hey, you write this and word for word, and we'll write this word for word. You know, a policeman who's interrogating people, if they all give exactly the same story using the same words, what do they think about it? Something fishy about it, isn't there? You expect to have some derivations and some different differences because we're different people. And the very fact that there were some of these differences in what it was called and how familiar they were and who went just makes sense. And if anything, gives validity to the story. Amen? We're past time and I didn't know it. I'm terribly sorry. We're past time. So we will get up and we will go from there, okay? We will go to that particular place and we'll pick up next week where we will start to look at the garden and the gospel in the garden. All right, let's stand together.